right. Hello, everybody, and happy Pride Month. Welcome to our first webinar this week celebrating Pride Month. My name is Emily Sprenger. I'm an academic trainer for the Center for Teaching and Learning. And I just very excited to have Dr. Glass here today for today's webinar, ACE and Asexual Identities, Expanding the LGBTQIA plus Rainbow. A couple of things as we move into the webinar. The chat is open, so feel free to, excuse me while I turn off my notifications there. Please feel free to put anything in the chat that you would like, have conversation in there. All the questions will be in the Q&A function of chat. Dr. Glass is gonna get to those as she sees fit throughout the presentation, but the bulk will probably be at the end. So please feel free to ask those questions in the Q&A. If you do want everyone to see what you're putting in the chat, please make sure that you are selecting all panelists and attendees in the drop-down function of the chat. Otherwise, it automatically defaults to just the panelists. Our webinar is being recorded and will be posted in the CTL webinar section. And I think without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Glass.
Yay! All right. Hi, everyone, and happy Pride Month. I am really super over the top excited to be talking to you about asexual identities. I am going to go through a lot of my research. I've done a research project on asexual identity spectrums, and that's going to kind of fill in the spaces. You're going to hear the voices of my asexual participants because that's really critical to understanding asexual identity. So I have the LGBTQIA, and the A is very large there because I wanted to point out some people are like, well, what is the A for? I don't know. So that's what we're looking at the A today. And I want to expand. Most people think gay and lesbian or gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, but you know, we're really expanding our rainbow. And I know Dr. Gary's presenting in a couple of week or two to talk about pansexuality and
couple of days.
So yeah, so we're expanding our rainbow here. And so there we have the Pride Month flag, but we also have, this is the asexual spectrum flag. So that is there for your awareness.
And Dr. Glass, yes. I just wanted to pop in one second here, just as a brief reminder. Dr. Glass actually asked me to send a PDF with some of the definitions that she plans to go over today. So you did get it in your email as long as you used the correct email for registration. So just so you're aware, in case you want to reference it, she also posted it in the chat right there as well.
Yeah. So that being said, I'm going to throw a lot of information out there, a lot of definitions that my participants use, but also that you might not be super familiar with. So I threw that reference in there so you could come back to it if things come up and you're like, I'm not sure, I don't remember what that was. So anyway, I'm going to start my conversation with a story Ellis told me. Ellis is one of the participants in the research study that I ran. And so Ellis wanted to tell a story about a situation. Ellis went with some friends to a coffee shop. They were super excited. It was in this real serene location, lots of trees and beauty around. And so the group of friends went and sat down. They're all drinking their coffees. And the conversation in the room turned into, you know, the people that Ellis was with were saying things like, oh, wow, yeah, yeah, that, yeah. And Ellis, you know, looked up from their drink and looked around and said, that tree really is gorgeous. Ellis made the assumption that they were talking about the tree when in actuality, this group of friends was talking about somebody who had walked by that they felt attracted to. And for the rest of their lives together as friends, that's become the running joke for this group of friends, that Ellis experiences attraction very differently and doesn't necessarily notice when someone who's hot walks by and makes those comments. So that's how I'm going to start my conversation. And so in the information sheet that you got, there's some definitions there. It's not an exhaustive list by any means, but in general, I want to share that the asexual spectrum is defined as people who don't experience a sense of physical sexual attraction. And so there's a huge spectrum of identities under there. You have demisexual, which is individuals who feel like they experience attraction, but only if they have a close bond. And then there's a graysexual person who maybe experiences attraction in slightly different ways or slightly different surroundings or situations. And under graysexual, there's the idea of ace flux. So that's a person that may be asexual in some instances and maybe not in other instances. So over on the other end of my presentation, you'll see allosexual, the term allosexual. Which is basically anyone who doesn't fit under the asexual umbrella. This is a person who does experience sexual attraction and, typically is most of the population for the most part. I do want to make sure I mention that none of this is a total binary. You're not asexual or allosexual. It is like anything else. There's a major spectrum there of differences. In addition, fluidity can exist. One person who may identify as asexual in one moment, demisexual in another moment, may shift at some point and identify in a slightly different way. So all that is there. Real quick before I go to the next slide, I do want to share that I am awful at doing two things at once. So I likely won't be checking the question box, but I will take a break at some point and check it. All right. Another piece of information I wanted to throw out there because it comes up in participants' language is the idea of the split attraction model. The split attraction model is something that a lot of asexual spectrum folks talk about. And it's the recognition that attraction can be more than just physical, that you have this physical attraction and you have romantic attraction. And a person can experience one of these. They can experience physical attraction or romantic attraction or both of them or neither of them. And so, it's a way to create language to discuss what asexual spectrum people are feeling and what that means to them. And this split attraction model isn't limited to just asexual spectrum individuals. As an allosexual individual, let's say you had a cisgender gay male who is physically attracted to other male identifying persons, but they may be romantically attracted to persons of all genders. So that person, even though they are not asexual spectrum, could still experience attraction in the split attraction model and define it in that way. So again, in your information sheet, I have written romantic identities. These fall under that idea of the split attraction model. Here's a few notable ones. Again, not an exhaustive list. But a person who's asexual who also identifies as aromantic doesn't experience sexual attraction or romantic attraction. A person who's asexual that considers themselves heteromantic experiences attraction with an opposite or different gender. A person who's homoromantic, same or similar gender. Biromantic, more than one gender. Panromantic, more than one gender. So in addition to having this idea of romantic identities, there's a lot of asexual people define themselves and how they experience desire. Asexual people experience varying levels, degrees of desire that include sexual experience is different, sexual focus is different, sexual frequency is different. A sex-averse individual considers himself to be not at all interested in sexual activity, also could be disgusted by it. It's not something they're at all interested in. A sex-indifferent person would engage in sexual activity, but it's not like I have to do it, it's something I really want to do right now, that kind of thing. There may be moments of that, but a sex-favorable person is an asexual person who's, enjoys sex or will engage in sex willingly. So this is a term, amatonormitivity is how you pronounce it, and it will come up again. This is the idea that relationships have one kind of look, that the whole world is striving for this, pie in the sky look of a relationship. It's heterosexual, it's monogamous, it's built on romance and sexual desire. I have this Disney princess dream, but I almost think it's the, bachelor, bachelorette dream. We have this desire to find that one solid soul person, and we're going to have great sex, and we're going to have a great romantic life together. This term came out of the polyamorous community, but has since been adopted by asexual communities and other communities to describe a difference. We don't all have to seek that same kind of relationship. There's Amatonormitivity talks about this idea of the social expectation of coupling, which you see in language all of the time. People will say, have you found your soulmate? Or, if you show up without a date to a party, somebody's going to say, oh, we'll get you someone, we'll find you someone, that kind of thing. And there's so many rituals that are about coupling and how important that is. And this kind of a metanormative relationship is above everything else. If you are a living together partner, you're not as good as this married, amazing, wonderful partnership. If you are, in a gay and lesbian relationship, you're still not as amazing as this, so it's basically, I'm exaggerating here, but that's kind of what the terminology means. So just a really brief background on asexuality. Kinsey, back in the 1950s, doing all of his sex research, found that there was a portion, about 1% of his participants, who didn't feel sexual attraction. And he labeled this group of individuals X, and did very little research on them other than to just identify that they were present in his research. Since that time, research has identified somewhere between 1% and 6% of the population fits into asexual identities. I argue that number is probably not quite accurate, because I think there are a lot of people who haven't, found this label for themselves, that maybe experience some of these things, but that the label hasn't come into their awareness. And again, there's that fluidity and that fluctuation. I think if a person identifies as demisexual, which means they experience sexual attraction, if they build a solid relationship first, if they feel a sense of connection, they may not have thought about it in quite the same way. Anyway, sexual functioning of asexual spectrum individuals, arousal, libido, sexual response doesn't differ from allosexual persons. So there isn't anything wrong. There's no major differences in asexual and allosexual persons in terms of mental health or well-being. Asexuality is not a disorder, hence the idea that it's a sexual orientation. It is labeled as a sexual orientation. And it's not a result of trauma. There are people that choose not to or do not engage in sexual activity because of a traumatic past, but that doesn't keep in mind, well, we'll talk about the coming out stuff in a minute. I'll get there. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is present a background of my current research and apply that to what's out there, so you can hear the voices of my participants. And I'll stop there. Emily, was there any notable questions that I should attack?
Yeah, let me see here for a second. There was a couple of things in the chat.
I can come back to it if it.
You know what? Someone was just mentioning in the chat, this is interesting because they just read an article in the New York Times where more people are starting to marry their best friend with no sexual relationship. So that's interesting. But one of the questions in the Q&A is, do those who have taken vows of celibacy fall under asexuality?
That's a good question. And I think I'm going to say it really would depend on the person. I think asexuality is something, again, we'll get into the coming out stuff in a minute, so that might answer that question a little bit. But I think asexuality is intrinsic. It is something people are born with. And so certainly if they're born with this and then they decide celibacy is the way to go, then certainly then that would fit. But I do think that some people choose celibacy. They choose it rather than it feeling part of who they are. So,
and then one more, is that okay?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. This one is from in the chat. How would you approach someone who is conflicted between, for instance, how they were raised religiously versus how they experience sexual attraction?
Oh, I love that question. I wish I could go on and on for days about that one. I have to go into some of my participants who who felt like their religion told them, hey, don't have sex until you're married. And so that they turned off, they turned off their any desire, need, or whatever. And then some of them would say, then they expect you to get married and turn the switch back on and figure it out. And so I think again, I could go into that, I think, more, but in general, I do think religion can play a major role in any LGBTQIA plus identity. So
probably an entirely different webinar as well too. I'm sure I could take up that much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, I'll check back in. All right, so my current research, what I wanted to do was look at the experiences of asexual spectrum participants specifically within the context of relationships. So all of my participants were in a relationship at the time I did the research study. And just real quickly, I'm going to run through the methodology really quick because I want to get to the voices. This was a qualitative research study done with the Gorgie method, for those of you who are familiar with that. The idea is really to capture the essence of the participants' experiences using direct intuition, bracketing, which is kind of setting aside your own standards or expectations. The analysis included a reading, a rereading, coding process that really kind of led to this phenomenological reduction process. So again, I can address any of that probably separately from this research study. And also real quick to go through, I had RB approval, I did a snowball sampling, I advertised in Facebook groups that I'm currently involved in, and participants self-selected. The criteria for participation is they had to be 18, they had to self-identify in the asexual spectrum, and they had to be in at least one relationship that they defined as committed. They were sent a demographic questionnaire, an informed consent, and they signed up for an interview. I did all of the interviews myself, and they ranged anywhere between 20 minutes and an hour, and they were recorded and transcribed. I will say that I was absolutely floored by my participants. I have never in my life had such a humbling experience, as they were so open and willing and excited to share their voice. And so I'm excited to share that with you as well. So a little snapshot. So I had 36 participants overall, and this is how they identified their asexual identity: 55 asexual, 55 demisexual, and 30% graysexual. That does go over 100. I know I can do my math a little bit. But yeah, some of them did identify in more than one category there. So somebody might identify as ace and gray, for example. And 50% of the participants found it important to note their romantic identity. Again, going back to that split attraction model. And of those 50%, 3 of them aromantic, 6 biromantic, 7 panromantic, and 2 gray romantic. In addition, some participants decided to label their sex favorability or interest identities, and 16 noted themselves as sex favorable, 9 as sex indifferent, and 2 as sex averse. So of these 36 participants, 21 disclosed other sexual orientations that included heterosexual or straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, or queer. And genders varied quite a bit. They're obviously looking at that. You can tell 24 females, but then there were quite a few non-binary participants: transgender, agender, gender fluid, male. And this is the one statement that surprises a great deal of people that know anything about my research, is that 25% of my participants disclosed that they identified as polyamorous. And I think that goes to challenge people's thinking about the role of sex in relationships, because people tend to think that doesn't fit, but it does. So demographics, most of the participants were in the US, a couple in the UK, 1 in Mexico, a very varying range of ages. All of my participants had at least some college, and participant professions varied quite a bit: social worker, veterinarian, law enforcement officer, lab supervisor. You can see the list there, and income varied quite a bit. So like I said, I'm going fast through these. Just want to get to their voices. So queer theory is the theory that guided my research. And the idea behind queer theory is that it challenges the assumptions of heteronormativity, that everyone is looking for this heteronormative relationship. But I'm taking this a bit further by adding on this amatonormitivity, thinking of amatonormitivity as a queer construct. In general, my participants were queering their relationship. They were looking at their relationship outside of that amatonormative and heteronormative norm. They wanted to define their relationships separately because they knew they were different, and that was how it worked. So the major themes I'm going to discuss through, again, I'm going to share with you a bunch of quotes and voices of the participants, but the themes that we're going to look at are first, an evolving sense of identity. There was a coming out process. Participants actively defining their relationship experiences, again, outside of that amatonormative norm, and providing paradigms that challenge social norms and language. So first, let's talk about identity. Building and understanding identity mirrors some of the experiences of other LGBTQ persons. There was this awareness at a young age. Then there was this recognition of language and what am I? What does this mean? And then finally, this kind of sense of self-acceptance or pride. You know, I'm a proud asexual individual. So I'm going to go through those. So here are some of my quotes. This is thinking about what people experienced at a young age. And somebody asked the question, and I think asexual orientation is something genuinely that people are born with. It is just a difference about who they are. And this really speaks to that. Emmeline stated, in middle school, everyone else would have posters of celebrity crushes. And I didn't have anything like that. I didn't understand it was over my head. Connor stated, I pretty much had gone through my whole life not quite getting what other men were particularly talking about when it came to women, like which actress is the hottest. I played a role, but I didn't have that kind of feeling. Raven stated, I started talking to doctors because I thought maybe there was a hormonal imbalance. There was something that seemed to be missing. I was talking to the psychiatrist and they were like, maybe you're asexual. I'd never heard of it. I had been looking for a fix or something. And Amy shared that in middle school, all the other girls would start talking about, oh my gosh, he's hot or he's sexy. And I recognized that he's aesthetically pleasing. His features align with that socio-cultural standard of attractiveness, but it had nothing to do with romance or sexuality. So back in that initial stage of trying to figure out their identity, so many of my participants talked about this sense of feeling broken, and they using the word terminology broken. There's something wrong with me. Alex said, I just kept going back to what's wrong with me. Am I broken? Amy approached it from a social context. I think a lot of people on the asexual, aromantic spectrum get a lot of microaggressions from heteronormative society. It is like you're seen as broken, like there's something fundamentally wrong with you if you don't want to get married and have babies. Ava said, nothing could solve my dislike for sex. And Bree stated, I felt like I was different. I just felt broken, or that something must have happened to me, even though I had no memory of anything. Everyone else seemed to feel something that I did not, and seemed to want things that I did not want. Connor stated, I definitely identify as feeling kind of broken around the whole sexual attraction thing, and it affected me a lot in different ways. So then the evolution of this coming out process is that they started to stumble upon language that really helped them explain what was happening. Jessica shared the moment I heard about demisexuality, it was just that one little sentence of needing to have an emotional connection before you wanted intimacy. And she was like, aha, that was the aha moment for her. Oh, Parker says, I'm not alone. Amy said, I found the terminology for romantic asexual. And I was like, yeah, I thought that way for a long time. And now to know that there's a whole community of people who feel the same way. Anita stated that language helped her and her husband. She said, it finally gave a name to one of the challenges my husband and I had in our relationship. And Claire stated finding out the term asexuality was a relief, and continued, people say that you don't need labels, and why do you want to come out? And I'm like, if you understood what it is like to not understand who you are and to get it, it's just mind-blowing. I live in a different world now than I did before. So finding language to explain what was happening was a super powerful experience to participants. And then to add to that, this idea of the split attraction model, which so many of my participants brought up without me even asking directly about it. Anita said she started looking into the split attraction model and went, oh my God, I experience romantic attraction, but don't think I ever experienced sexual attraction. Megan shared, talking about the romance aspect of it and how people recognize themselves as sexually in the romantic side of it. It's so interesting to see what everyone is on the scale. There's a huge spectrum of everything. Like I'm polyromantic or biromantic, and there are people who have no romantic connection. I think Megan's quote here is really important because when I say asexual spectrum, I mean spectrum. There are so many different experiences, as you see in the sex averse, sex indifferent, sex favorable category. I mean, that is a wide range of people that are experiencing and understanding asexuality in very different ways. Alex shared that they learned more about romantic identities and stated, I think it's cute seeing people in happy relationships, but when I try to apply it to myself, there's a disconnect. As much as I adore these kinds of relationships, I never really had romantic feelings for anyone. I didn't connect to any of it. The closest I had was platonic crushes. I see someone and want to be this person's best friend. And that reminds me of the question that was in there too. There are individuals who are getting married to their friends or somehow making a commitment to that friend. And there's a terminology that's not on your sheet called queer platonic relationship, QPR, which you see a little bit in asexual communities, where people are identifying their relationship as more platonic, but different than a friend. So we could go on about that one too, but I'll leave it there. So after all of that, recognizing language, there seems to be a process that's like this relief, as you can see. Claire said, I can entirely be myself. And Miranda says, I couldn't understand it all, but it's been very liberating to figure out what's going on. I don't feel attraction to people in the normative way, and I don't have to try to force it. Blake said he felt very liberated at the idea that there wasn't anything wrong. Anita stated, I no longer feel broken. Claudia said, I felt like taking off a weight that I didn't know I had. So there was a major relief when that identity was discovered, uncovered, better understood. So let's go into the second theme, where I am basically making the argument that participants are actively defining their relationship in a way that doesn't fit into this amatonormative space. You know, we know we're different, so what does it look like? So this is what it looks like. There is a misconception out there that asexual people aren't seeking relationships. Research identifies that asexual persons are often, or not always, in relationships with allosexual persons. I will say in the first bullet there, the misconception, most research that looks or asks about coupling, only about a third of individuals in most of that research identify they're not in a relationship. So that's basically saying that about 2/3 of asexual individuals do report being in relationships. So they seek out intimacy at times outside of sexual experiences. So their intimacies may be met differently than the expectation, and communication is a big part of that. So I'm going to dive into these a little further. One of the ideas that popped into the research was this idea that asexual individuals define slowing to warm in their sexual relationships, that there's a different process there for them. For those that were sex favorable or sex indifferent, they would engage in sex, but there was this different process getting to the stage that felt comfortable to them. Emmeline stated, my wife and I joke that I have this really high activation energy that I have to cross over to even consider the act. She said, I can feel good from it. I just have no desire to pursue it. And I don't like touch. I like platonic touch. Jessica shared a similar idea of needing a warming up thing to feel a connection. So intimacy needs are met differently. Gene shared that if his partner is feeling a lack of intimacy, he asks him what he needs, and that many people share their love in a sexual format, and that's just not there for us. Recognizing, hey, it doesn't work that way for me, so we got to try something different. Alex shared that they feel completely fulfilled in the area of intimacy. In fact, that mirrors what's in the research, that asexual people are feeling like their intimacy needs are met. AP stated, I'm sex neutral and I'll participate. It can be fun. I can really enjoy it. And sometimes I can get totally repulsed by it and I want nothing to do with it. And Ava shared, every time we would have sex, I'd be judging myself. And so when I was finally in this place where I could just be free and not enjoy this, but enjoy the fact that I'm connecting to my partner and it's something that two of us share, it became freeing. I'm able to get out of a self-judgment place during sex. So of my 36 participants, all but 2 were mentioned being in relationships with allosexual partners. So they had very different needs and experiences and ways of looking at the world. And the two that didn't report an allosexual partner said that they didn't know, meaning that their partner was in a stage where they were still trying to figure out some of this. So they could still also have been allosexual. And one of the things that popped in was this idea of guilt, recognizing that I can't do this the way my partner wants to do it. So without even getting into that, I'll say that they resolved that. You know, they were very excited and spoke very highly of their partners in the end, and somehow they were able to get through it. Like Megan shares that her wife has taken it very personally at times when she wasn't feeling attracted to her. And Riley stated about their partner, I felt really bad that I wasn't being part of the relationship in that way and what might be expected of me, but he was so good about it. And the whole time never pushed me or tried to be like, oh, get over it. He was just really gentle and was like, okay, when you're ready. Sally stated, the most challenging part has been convincing my husband that it's not a matter of his attractiveness or capabilities. It took a really long time for him to understand that's just the way my brain is wired. And Claire said, for him, sex is one of his core needs, and his love language is the way he receives love. He really, really, really needs to be desired, and it is essentially the one thing I can't do for him. So what did they do? They did it a little different. So it was, how they did it a little differently was based in this idea of respect. There was, the participants I interviewed spoke so highly of their partners. Amy stated that her and her partner were just really concerned about caring for each other. We're a team. Anita said, my husband's a very giving person. He knew that sex wasn't going to be a high priority thing for us. He's much more aware of me and what I need and doesn't push things on me. Bree stated, my partner's pansexual and he's a completely different person. I think we get along really well. We meet in the middle for a lot of stuff, and it's just basically about respect. The key component was no pressure. Those that shared, you know, that this relationship worked, stated it worked because there wasn't pressure to engage in sex activities from their partner. Kai shared a conversation with their partner. I brought up that even when we get married, it's not going to change the fact that I'm asexual and, you know, I'm not interested in sex. And he said that he's willing to work, and that he said multiple times, if I don't want to do it, then I'm not obligated to do it. He meaning the partner. Claudia stated he is definitely allosexual, but he is also very patient. She describes that he makes sexual suggestions, and if she says, no, not right now, he doesn't pressure her. So as you see, communication is a big tool that participants used. Kim stated, we have this constant conversations about sex drive for me and us, and how that doesn't have a correlation between how I feel about him. Lindsay shared they use radical honesty. Megan stated, you know, if you want to have sex more, just tell me and we can make it happen. But I just kind of don't think about it. Connor stated, with my spouse, it's pretty much transparency, complete transparency, openness. We talk about everything. And E stated that during sexual activity, they have check-ins and communicate, and they reinforce the idea that there isn't anything wrong, and it's just the brain and body and the way it's working. So moving beyond this amatonormitivity, different participants did different things. This first participant, Joni, talked about all my current partners are allosexual, and Joni was in a polyamorous relationship, so she didn't feel the pressure to meet anyone's needs in a sexual way. And I wanted to bring this in here because I think poly relationships were one way that a couple of participants found to supplement what was happening. If they felt like their partner needed more physical sexual activity, then that was one way that they explored that. So recognizing pride and self as part of the relationship equation. So being able to own that identity and present it to the partner. Bree stated, it is impossible to be able to communicate with your partner and express your needs if you don't first have a good sense of self-worth and boundaries. And Eleanor stated, people feel sex is an important part of a relationship, and not wanting to do it will make people not want to be in a relationship. But for us, Eleanor and the partner, there are so many things that are more important than sex. So talking about more important than sex, like, oh wait, did I skip one? No, maybe it's not there yet. This was my favorite finding. So when I asked the question, what's the best thing about being asexual, I would get this huge like smile and relief, and like they were excited to tell me what was the best thing about being asexual. And I think people who are allosexual might find these responses a little bit amusing. Amusing not in a patronizing way at all, but just that, oh, people think differently than me way. Like Joni says, if I think about it compared to what everyone deals with on a daily basis, it eliminates this huge distraction. Like I don't have to worry about being sexually attracted. I think it would cloud all kinds of judgment and opportunity. Kim said, the best thing is the fact that I'm not led around by the nose by my hormones. And Miller stated, I think a lot of people who don't identify in the A spectrum are just blinded to how vulnerable you can actually be without touching a person. Amy stated, there's a whole genre of bullshit I don't have to deal with, like the awkward sexual tension or the whole dance. Ella stated, I definitely say I'm the best wingman because I'm not competition. I can look at a lot of situations without being as distracted. My friends, they were like, I bought a more expensive car because the guy was cute, or I ordered an extra dish because the waiter was pretty. And I'm like, I have armor immunity to things like that. So, again, intimacy needs are met differently. Megan mentioned enjoying hugging and kissing and cuddling, and participants mentioned enjoying laughter, fun, and conversation, and that these completely met their intimacy needs. I want to bring up a little bit about consent, because I think it's important. Consent in itself is super important, but thinking about that amatonormitivity and how pressured the participants had felt at some point in their life to meet that expectation, to the point that they were consenting to things that they didn't really want to do. So a few of my participants talked about recognizing this different kind of consent. Miller shared that as a demisexual person, V feels that the whole concept of consent is important. Basically questioning, am I doing this to please them, or if I'm wanting this, or if I'm just nice and going with it? And so the more difficult part for me is just trying to validate and reaffirm that this is something I want, whether my attraction is there right now, and making sure I have full consent. Anita shared a similar situation. My ex was very hypersexual, and I was constantly compromising my needs for his. Everything was always consensual, but persuaded. Claudia shared, we have this movement of feminism and empowering your body and owning your sexuality and enjoying it. And I couldn't fit into those standards. I felt like I wanted to fit in. I wanted and would force myself into certain situations. In the end, it was consensual, but I committed to it because I thought eventually I would find enjoyment in it. The extremes at which they went to try to quote unquote fix this brokenness and fit into what they saw was the norm. The supports that participants brought in included friends. Kai right here has a lot of queer friends. Therapists, many of the participants mentioned going to therapists at some point in their life. And many shared that their therapists were supportive or at least willing to learn about it. Partners were one of the main supports, families, communities. Many of them found social media communities. Lindsay here is part of the kink community. There was a lot of mixed reviews around the LGBTQIA plus community. For some people, there was a sense that the queer community didn't recognize them or was too hypersexualized, and so it didn't feel comfortable to them. But one quote here, Bree stated, I found my place in the queer community. As you noticed in the beginning, a lot of participants did share queer identities outside of asexual spectrum stuff. So, that in itself, they may have felt welcomed in the queer community based on a different identity that fit for them. So as a therapist, I did ask participants, what advice would you give therapists? And overall, overarching was this idea of cultural competency, making sure therapists know and understand what asexuality spectrum stuff is, doing research ahead of time. Many participants talked about having to educate their therapists being open to it, but still them having to put in that work. Recognizing that asexuality is this wide spectrum. Awareness of language around expectations and relationships. I think, as a therapist myself, you ask about relationships, sometimes you jump into, tell me about your sex life, and make an assumption of what you expect to hear there and what would be healthy or unhealthy. Being aware of personal biases around your own relationships, expectations, sex activity, what's healthy, what's unhealthy, being aware of the split attraction model. And I didn't bring this up much, but a lot of participants shared somewhere in there, this is not about trauma, this is who I am. Like they had to go through that journey themselves, and they really want people to know that you don't make the assumption like, oh, you had a traumatic experience, this is why you're this way. And similar to the idea of not being broken, that there is a lot of background doctors saying, hey, there's something wrong with you if you can't do this. Therapists saying, oh, you need to have sex. That's a human need, and this is how it should look. And recognizing that it's not about being broken. But one of the other things that they shared is how important it is to share with clients. Again, I'm a therapist, but this might be something even as you're thinking of your friends and your communities, like letting people know that asexuality is out there and it is an identity. It can be very affirming, and helping people like, oh, have you heard of this? Here's a resource, something to look into, and just being aware of it and educating yourself, but also letting other people know. All right, I'm going to end with this amazing quote from Claire. Claire stated, "It is like the sun has just come out for this whole orientation and people are waking up. People want to say, that's me. People can see me now. It feels really awesome." And that is totally the feeling I got from my participants. They were so excited to share with me. They had felt invisible, and I felt like I was giving them this platform to share their voice. And I am doing it with you guys today because it feels very empowering myself. And so there you go. There are my references. I am happy to now take questions.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Glass. A couple of people came just a tad bit late in the very beginning. There are several questions to get to, but just so everyone's aware, all the attendees, this is being recorded, and we will post this webinar on the CTL Webinars LibGuides page. Of course, if you have any additional questions or need access to it, you can always email me at espranger@ncu.edu. Several questions in the Q&A, Dr. Glass, so we'll see how much we can get to it in the time frame we have. Absolutely. The first question in the Q&A. We're curious to read about the studies more, but how would asexuality be measured in terms of sexual response or libido?
I think I would argue that it would be impossible to measure that way. It is really self-report. And I think just the same as, I don't know, I'm trying to think in my head real quickly and it didn't come to me, but yeah, I think asexuality really comes from this sense of self-report, because there is no difference in terms of libido, sexual functioning, arousal. None of that is different. It really is a matter of, you don't experience it in quite the same way. And it feels different. So.
Thank you, Dr. Glass. The next question in the Q&A, how would you label someone who's interested in sexual acts, able to be aroused alone, but disgusted by the thought of being physically intimate with another person? And in this particular instance, they mentioned not wanting to be physically active with another person due to abuse.
No, I don't know that a label isn't always necessary. I think that there's a couple of things I would think about there as as someone who's dived into this research, but also I should share that I also identify as demisexual. So I fit into this asexual umbrella. I think that certainly that could be an asexual identity. I think I would go back to, when did you first feel this way? You know, were you always aware that you were disgusted by sex with another person? Many of my participants talked about personal masturbation. A couple of my participants talked about being grossed out by partners and having sex with partners, and that would fit for them. It sounds like this experience would fit for them. You know, again, I like to totally separate this idea of trauma, because I do think that people who've experienced trauma do take themselves out of situations purposefully and or have reactive feelings, traumatic feelings when they engage in relationships. So that's a whole nother piece of it too. But I don't think you know, I think anyone could fit under that asexual umbrella that experiences what that person just asked in that question, but wouldn't necessarily, depending on that trauma and how it influenced them.
Another question. Thank you so much for having this today. In the Q&A, my husband and I, my husband has started to identify as demisexual because he was previously unaware that this identity existed. Is there any particular considerations or obstacles that demisexual individuals have should they desire to come out or publicly identify? There's a follow-up question. Does this become more complicated when he is also a cisgender and is demisexual with females, since he can appear heterosexual? And in case you need to reference it, you can open up your Q&A, because that was a long one. Let me know if you need me to recap.
That is a long one. And I am thinking about one participant in particular that I had, who he identified as a cis male, as demisexual, and he was a police officer. So he was in this kind of hyper masculinized field. And so he talked a lot about how, you know, he'd go out with the guys and people would be like, oh man, did you get some last night, and stuff like that. And that didn't resonate for him. He was uncomfortable with that conversation, but yet he was having plenty of very, in his words, healthy sex on a regular basis with his partner. And that was a very comfortable thing to him. And it sounds like a very similar journey where he was like, oh, demisexual, I get it now. Like, I don't experience it unless I am super connected with this person. But when you are in a long-term relationship and you're super connected with that person, then your sexual activity probably doesn't look that much different than your neighbors, you know, that your desire for that person is still there. So the other part of that question is about coming out. And that also was a very personal journey, no matter demisexual or other asexual spectrum identities. Some people didn't think it was all that worthwhile to come out, to share it with anyone, because, you know, like it was their part of their private worlds. For other people, they wanted to stand up on their roofs and yell and scream, this is how I'm different, and I've figured it out, and it's exciting for me. And I think for the majority of participants, if they were in small friend groups, they might do like the tree example I did in the beginning, where they're telling their friends, hey, I do this a little differently. So when you're saying, oh my gosh, she's hot, I'm not going to feel that. And so recognizing that with friends, your conversation might look a little bit different, or, you know, it just leads to the other folks trying to figure out how that makes sense to you. So I think coming out is a very personal decision, and it can feel liberating. It did for some of my participants. It can help dating relationships, you know, if you come out ahead of time. If you're dating someone, certainly that makes sense. I don't know. I'm trying to think of what else was in that question, but I think I've captured it all.
Absolutely. Any suggestions for those who are in a committed relationship and or marriage, for those who identify on different sides of the spectrum? For example, I identify as panromantic and my husband as demisexual. We are both strong together, but we always welcome more information and insight.
Mm-hmm. I love that. So my quick and easy answer, again, going from my research, is just communication. Like something I have personally learned doing therapy is with couples is that there are so many different ways to communicate And to be able to say, hey, I need this, this feels good, I want this, you know, being able to say that stuff out loud is really critical to the health of a relationship. And I found that my participants were saying the same thing, you know, they would self-disclose with each other exactly what the need was in that moment. They were very vocal about it. They had a completely open door policy to questions for each other, what that looked like. And so, yeah, I mean, it sounds like an easy phrase to say, communication, right? You know, like we all want to say that we do that, we do that well, but I think it's constantly reimagining how you can do it better. You know, how can you say it in a different way? How can you, you know, I told a client the other day, tell your partner what felt good and why it felt good, you know, after you're done, you know, with the sexual activity, tell them what, you know, what was good about that. and then that allows for the conversation to open up even more. So maybe a situation like that with this individual.
Thank you, Dr. Glass. Another question in the Q&A. So what about those of us that feel like we did not identify on the asexual spectrum until well into adulthood?
You know, that's part of something that's puzzling to me a little bit too. But I believe in fluidity. I have a good friend who described herself and she was a cisgender woman, dated a man, married a man, was heterosexual all the way, and ended up now married to a woman. And she tells me her process, like, I don't really understand what happened, but I fell in love and that's what happened. And, you know, so I think sexual orientation in general, it has some fluidity to it. And I'm going to throw asexual spectrum stuff right in there, you know, that people do shift throughout their lifetime. And it's not that unusual to do that. So yeah, I don't have a direct answer, but I do think we're all on our own journey and we all have our own process and everyone's going to do it differently.
Thank you so much for that. Question in the Q&A. How would you describe the differences between romantic attraction and sexual attraction? For instance, if someone experiences romantic attraction, but not sexual attraction, what is the difference there?
So romantic attraction, I'll just totally go by me, okay? So I'm demisexual, but I experience high levels of romantic attraction. So when I was a kid, you know, I was that kid who daydreamed about, oh, this is gonna happen, and I'm gonna hold hands and walk through the park, and I had this like really lovely perspective on what my romantic world would look like. But if you had said to me like, oh, but you're going to go have sex with that person, I would have been like, no, what? Are you kidding me? Like, I don't know them well enough yet. That doesn't make sense to me. And so like, and the opposite is true for a lot of people. They meet a person, they have high levels of physical attraction. You know, they may say straight out the bat, I want to sleep with that person. I want to have sex with that person. I want to feel them, or whatever they might feel. But then they don't really want a long-term relationship, you know, like that's not that important to me. I'm not going to go there. So, you know, and again, both of those things are in levels. So people experience both of them in varying degrees.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glass. Question we have here in the Q&A, and it's about one of the marriage and family therapy courses. So I am currently in marriage and family therapy, couples and sex therapy course. And I noticed that the warming up phrase that you mentioned in your slides sounded like the sensate or caressing method of therapy where the couple is usually focusing on touching without it leading to sex. How is this similar or different from those on the asexual spectrum?
You know, I'm not going to like put all asexual people in a box because some of them didn't need warming up. So, you know, they all varied quite a bit in that, but I thought of the same thing, actually. I thought of some of those sensate focused ideas when I was interviewing some of my participants, because there did seem to be a need for some of them. And I'm going to even go so far to say more of the demisexual, sex favorable folks. that there needed to be this really strong level of trust and some kind of like, again, the warming up, like this sense of touch without sex, or something that made them feel like that they could trust to the next level. I think sensate focus would be an awesome tool for that, maybe, depending on the person. Again, asexual orientations are so vast and how they're expressed. But yeah, so I want to add to that, that there were participants who didn't need that warming up, that they were sex favorable, they would engage in sex, some of them sex indifferent, they would engage in sex and have a good time, and it was totally fine. They could just take it or leave it, you know, so.
Thank you so much. I have a few more if you if you can hang in there with me.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So this is in the Q&A. So just to make sure I understand, an asexual individual may find romance and intimacy in other forms rather than sexual activity. Is that correct?
It could be correct depending on the person. I think in general, the asexual spectrum, the definition is that it's a person who doesn't experience sexual attraction. And so I think of that as that foundational piece, that somebody walks by and you go, oh my gosh, I want sex with them. That's a little bit blunt and not the way I think of all allosexual people thinking, but you know what I mean? Like there is something that keeps them from having that initial reaction, that they don't have that. It's not part of it. Yeah, I feel like I lost the question, but I think I answered it.
You did actually. And it kind of comes back to like, it's a vast spectrum, so that it could be anything for anyone. You said you don't want to put them in a bubble either. So
yeah, even the definition of asexual is a person that doesn't experience sexual attraction. There were a couple participants who said to me, I never experienced sexual attraction until I met this one person. Okay. And so then they were like, wait a minute, what the heck is this? I don't get it. And so they would still identify themselves as asexual, because still in crowds of people or whatever, they still just that one person. It's just that one person. And so there was, again, variability in there. But.
Okay, and this actually has to do with your study. How old were the participants?
They were varying in ages. They had to be 18. I had the statistics there, so if you go back and look at it, you'll see. But in general, they were between 25 and 35. I think that was 61% were in that age bracket. But I had them up to 58. I think I had one participant that's 58 and one, I think the lower end was like 21. So.
Okay, thank you. One of the participants in your study mentioned identifying as being sex neutral. Is this the same thing as being sex indifferent, or is there a difference?
Yeah, I think I would say that those were two words you could say were similar.
Okay, great. Having been married for almost 10 years, how do you break the news to your significant other that you are asexual, especially when they are very much into sex and you are not?
I do want to put out there that I had one participant who was in the same situation, to the point that she was in the middle of the interview with me and said, I got to go, and hung up with me, and sent me an email later and said, my husband came home and I wasn't expecting him, and he didn't, you know, he was not aware of my identity. I would say that one person was an extreme different type of scenario than all my other participants, and that all my other participants, the partners, were aware and had the opportunity to learn and grow about it, figure it out. So I don't have the major tool for that and how to bring that up. I do know that a lot of asexual people feel totally invalidated when they bring it up to partners or family members or whoever. That would be something I'd be super cautious about, finding supports outside of that partner relationship, so that, and giving people time to understand, to adjust, to learn about it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there must be, that's a tough situation. There must be people out there that absolutely feel that way. And it's a difficult thing to express depending on the relationship. So
yeah, and I'll put in there that there were folks that I interviewed who kind of thought about that experience of talking with partners, or identifying, and it helped them. The language helped them to understand what was happening, and that for again, a couple participants, that was a really useful conversation that they had. Like, and they felt a little bit more free. Like, I don't have to lie that I'm feeling this way when I'm not.
thank you for sharing that. Whoever the anonymous attendee is. How would you label someone who has only ever been attracted physically, sexually, or romantically to a singular person? You kind of mentioned that earlier.
Well, I don't throw labels on people, because I think that could be anything. Some people are just picky. I think that could totally be part of it. But yeah, like my participant I just mentioned, who said, I never felt sexual attraction, but now I'm married to this person that I felt sexually attracted to. And that works out well for them, so but that person identified themselves as asexual. So, but yeah, I think even allosexual people have variability. There's even a spectrum there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Glass. There are still so many questions in the Q&A, but we don't have time for all of them today. I appreciate all of the attendees, and Dr. Glass, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. And I just want to say happy Pride Month. And this recording will be posted in the CTL webinars LibGuides page. And if anybody has any questions about it, please feel free to reach out to me via email. You can find me in the comments as well too. So thank you so much, Dr. Glass.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for listening.